Hello everybody. A few weeks ago, the skeptic atheist corner of the Twitter sphere was very worked up over humanism, veganism, dishonesty and Matt Dillahunty. No one really wanted to know my take on this whole thing, so I decided to make a video about it. So is humanism a moral framework? What about veganism? Who's being dishonest in this discussion and why can't we all just get along? Stay with me if you want to find out. My name is Tal and this is Due Diligence. So about a month ago, Drew McCoy, aka Genetically Modified Skeptic, released a video titled Why I as an Atheist am no longer a Humanist. In this video, he explains that he doesn't think that the label of humanist correctly defines his moral philosophy, because he believes that moral consideration should also be given to non-human animals. After someone mentioned him in a tweet that shared the video, Matt Dillahunty responded that the video's title is misleading clickbait, and a long thread of Twitter debate ensued. That was every bit as topical and rational as you'd expect from a Twitter debate. Everyone joined in on the action, including yours truly, but it seemed that the two main characters in the center of this were Matt and Alex O'Connor, aka Cosmic Skeptic. Drew, funnily enough, really wasn't. The whole thing escalated quickly, and at its climax, Matt blocked Alex on Twitter, which surprisingly didn't really have much of a calming effect. So, a few notes up front. Some of you watching will know that I am an absolute fanboy of Alex's, so you'd probably expect me to be on his side of this discussion, and if you do, then you ain't wrong. However, I also greatly appreciate Matt's work. He's done a lot to destigmatize atheism and to promote skepticism. I think he's an excellent communicator and I can definitely say that I learned a lot from him. I also think that he and I share a lot of our morality. But while I think that Alex's views are generally very well thought out, I can't really say the same for all of the views that Matt espouses, especially when it comes to morality. I do think that our answers to most moral questions will probably match, but I often struggle to understand how his reasoning works. It always seems somewhat half-baked. I am very much on Alex's side when it comes to the vegan issue, and I have been accused of only defending his views because I'm such a fanboy, but I'm happy to say that I've actually been on the vegan wagon long before Alex, though I do admit I think he is much more committed to it than I am. As I mentioned, it all started with a video from Genetically Modified Skeptic about how his outlook on morality had changed and how he doesn't feel that humanist serves as a good enough label anymore. I should probably mention that I thought of making a similar video a few months ago. The fact that a lot of the discourse treats secular morality and humanism as synonyms always bothered me, for pretty much the same reason that Drew talks about. I totally agree that well-being is an excellent anchor for secular morality. I just see no justification for it being specifically human well-being. Now let's see where Twitter took it.
Why tag me? Humanism isn't humans are the center of the universe. Has Drew bothered to read the Humanist manifestos? There's nothing about humanism that puts it at odds with veganism. Nothing. This is either clickbait or confusion, or both.
Lloyd Evans replied saying,
I have to agree, Matt. There are many things in this world that need to be called out, condemned, or disavowed. Humans not needing belief in the supernatural in order to treat each other well isn't one of them. It's the weirdest of hills to die on.
This equivocation that Lloyd makes is exactly what I was talking about before. Drew said that he's not a humanist, and Lloyd interprets it as Drew rejecting the idea of a secular moral system, where humans can treat each other well without believing in the supernatural. Lloyd treats humanism as a synonym for secular morality. Does he really think that this is all that humanism is? Because if you read the Humanist Manifesto, it clearly involves more than just this one thing. In fact, treating other humans well is only stated in the manifesto as a practical implication of the idea that ethical values are derived from human need and interest. It's an important part of the humanist life stance, to be sure, but it is very far from being the entire thing. It is possible to accept that we don't need supernatural beliefs to treat each other well, and to still reject other parts of humanism. including the grounding that it suggests for why we should treat each other well. And if we do, then we're not humanists. But more to the point, Drew actually says that his basic moral consideration is the well-being of any being capable of suffering.
The case for equal moral consideration of any beings, human or not, may only rest firmly on the consideration of those beings' ability to suffer.
By definition, he A. does not ground his morality specifically in human well-being, meaning he rejects the humanist grounding for morality and can therefore not be said to accept humanism, at least not as a whole. And B. he accepts that we should treat each other well while grounding it explicitly in the natural world. No supernatural beliefs required. It's not just that Drew doesn't say that he rejects the idea of not needing supernatural beliefs to treat each other well. The moral grounding that he asserted in this video actually affirms this idea. I really don't see how Lloyd could miss this point if he was being honest. Now Matt adds that
Drew, in this video, acknowledges this point and says he could still call himself a humanist, but that humanism doesn't go far enough. Which means he is a humanist, he just wants humanism plus veganism, which he can do without dropping the label. Clickbait.
And here's Lloyd again.
Yes, I caught that too. If he basically acknowledges that he's still a humanist, then the title and thumbnail are at best superfluous, at worst misleading and engineered for clicks. Disappointing.
Here's the part of Drew's video that they're referring to.
I don't think this position of mine disqualifies me from adopting the label of humanist. From what I can tell, humanism is often expressed as the proclivity toward utilizing reason rather than religious dogma in problem solving, or as the valuing of human well-being over some divine order. I could still call myself a humanist, I think, because I identify with those humanist values.
I actually think that Drew is wrong in how he puts it. He does share a lot of his life stance with humanists, that much is true. But I don't think he is a humanist, because when it comes to morality, even though his conclusions might align very well with humanism, at least when it comes to humans, his basic justification differs greatly.
My sphere of moral consideration extends beyond humans, though, and that isn't a value which seems to be included under the humanist label most of the time. In fact, from my observations, it seems that for some, humanism prioritizes the concerns of humans at the direct expense of other animals.
The Humanist Manifesto 3 clearly states that for the humanist, ethical values are derived from human need and interest, and that humanists ground values in human welfare, whereas Drew's ethical values are derived from and grounded in other assumptions.
A capacity for suffering is the only attribute which we may take into account to be logically consistent and grounding the idea that all humans must be given equal moral consideration. If we so ground our principle of equal consideration, though, we find no basis for refusing equal moral consideration for non-humans with a capacity for suffering.
Put simply, to know if a creature's well-being deserves moral consideration, Drew would ask if this creature is capable of suffering, and the humanist would ask if it's a human. If a white supremacist wanted to know the same thing, she'd ask if the creature is a white person. And the fact that she and the humanist would give the same answer if that creature was, say, Drew McCoy, doesn't mean that the humanist is a white supremacist. Similarly, the fact that the humanist and Drew would give the same answer if that creature was, say, any human, doesn't make Drew a humanist, right? I mean, they might sometimes agree on who has moral worth, but that doesn't mean that their morality is identical. You don't have to agree with Drew here. Maybe you think that the question that the humanist would ask is the better choice, but you can't act as though they are the same.
I won't pretend humanists can't agree with me on all of this, or that I don't share most of my values with humanists. If you're a humanist and you're watching this, great. We're allies on most things, and I think we're perfectly capable of constructively discussing where we are not aligned.
Drew and myself do have a lot more in common with humanists than humanists usually have with white supremacists. And as he mentions, we could be their allies on many issues, but our morality is still based in something very different from that of the humanist, and this difference is significant. Drew said in his video that he doesn't really know which term to use for his ethical framework. I agree that the options that we have aren't great.
While the following labels have their own drawbacks in that they're either lesser known or often poorly understood, I do like the labels of sentientist and ethical vegan when they can be usefully communicated.
This Twitter mania exposes the problems with that latter one. Matt and others here keep saying that you can be a humanist and vegan. And not surprisingly, they don't use the term ethically vegan. People have grown too accustomed to thinking of veganism mainly in terms of food choices, maybe also something to do with consumption of animal products in general, but not as an ethical framework. If you can be vegan because it's healthier, or because it's more environmentally friendly, or because your God commands it, or whatever, then even if in many cases it is an ethical choice, it's not an ethical framework. And when people use the word vegan in this way, then yes, you can be a humanist and vegan. You can be a humanist and not consume animal products. You might even be able to ground your choice not to consume those products in your humanism. But you cannot be ethically vegan and a humanist. You cannot hold that human well-being is how you ground your moral values, and the well-being of all sentient beings is how you ground them. Because if you do, then in practice your values are grounded in the well-being of all sentient life, humans included. So I prefer the term sentientist. It might be a bit of a mouthful, and most people probably won't understand what it means, but they at least won't assume that they do. If they cared, they would ask. And sure, part of the beauty of humanism is that it's not conservative or traditionalistic. In fact, the third manifesto actually mentions that values and ideals are subject to change as our knowledge and understanding advance. This means that for all we know, the Humanist Manifesto 4 might change its definitions to say that humanists ground values in the well-being of any sentient creature. And then humanism and ethical veganism really would no longer conflict. But if this change does happen, then why would we still call it humanism? I mean, wouldn't it make more sense to change the label to reflect its new moral foundation? Maybe to something like, Sentientism? But I am happy to consider other labels if you have ideas. With all that in mind, let's examine Matt and Lloyd's clickbait accusation. So what is clickbait? According to Merriam-Webster, it's something designed to make readers want to click on a hyperlink, especially when the link leads to content of dubious value or interest. That is, it makes people think that there's more to the content than there actually is. According to Wikipedia, clickbait is a link designed to attract attention and to entice users to follow that link and read, view, or listen to the linked piece of online content with a defining characteristic of being deceptive. So clickbait is something that's dishonestly trying to get traffic, or as Lloyd says, misleading and engineered for clicks. I think it's safe to say that Drew wants his titles to attract viewers. So do I. I think everyone does. Being engineered for clicks really isn't much of an accusation, is it? So I guess it comes down to the misleading part. This is a video about
how I stopped thinking of myself as a humanist,
and it is titled Why I Am No Longer a Humanist. He no longer considers himself a humanist, and the title says that he isn't a humanist. I don't see how that's misleading, and if it isn't, how can it be clickbait? Let's now take a look at the Twitter brawl between Matt and Alex. I'll just skip the first few comments in this thread and arrive at Matt saying,
Well, firstly, I was talking about the denotation of clickbait. Secondly, the closest denotation of humanism would probably be the Secular Humanist Manifesto, currently at version 3, or the Credo of Humanist Organizations.
In response, Alex explains,
Here is the disagreement then, surely, from the Humanist Manifesto 3. Humanists assert ethics is grounded in human welfare. Ethical vegans assert it is grounded in the suffering of all conscious creatures. You might say that the manifesto doesn't say ethics is only about human welfare, but that is the clear implication. I wouldn't support an ethical movement that grounded morality in male welfare, since that is too exclusionary, even though such a statement doesn't technically conflict with also caring about the welfare of non-males.
And then here's Matt's response, or lack thereof.
Do you prioritize human welfare over the welfare of a chicken in scenarios where those come in conflict? If you do, that's still consistent with what you've highlighted. At no point is it humans only or anti-non-human. If you don't, well, that ends it.
Matt says that if Alex prioritizes humans, then it is okay to say that human welfare is the grounding of his morality. Now, I'm sure most humanists, Matt included, give their family and friends' well-being more moral consideration than they do other humans. But that's not the same as saying that they ground their ethical values in the well-being of their friends and family. They still ground them in human well-being in general. And in the same way, the fact that many ethical vegans would give human well-being more moral consideration doesn't mean that we ground our ethical values in human well-being. We still ground them in the well-being of all sentient life. It really is a shame that Alex goes on to answer Matt's deflection here instead of pressing on this point, which is far more relevant. But Alex doesn't press on, and he answers Matt's question.
I grant each equal moral consideration qua their capacity to suffer, which amounts to granting the human more moral worth, being capable of different kinds of suffering that chickens can't experience. So ethics is grounded in the well-being of all conscious creatures, but that's not the same as saying they have the same moral worth.
Alex says that he gives humans more moral worth because we are capable of more suffering. It's amusing because about 2 weeks ago he released a video on how animal suffering is a huge problem for the Christian belief that there's a good God, and in this video he responds to things that William Lane Craig said on the matter. And the funny thing is that one of Dr. Craig's points had to do with this supposed difference between the way we suffer and the way that animals do. Alex completely rejects this point, treating it as though Dr. Craig doesn't think that animals actually experience suffering at all. Like, he says that they feel pain, but they do not suffer. So, I thought this was funny, but the important thing is that I don't think it's a good justification. I don't think it's a tenable position. We don't really know that animals suffer less. It's a very ad hoc solution that tries to rationalize why we care more about our own. But it's based on a very wild assumption. For all we know, maybe dogs or pigs or even chickens suffer more than we do. Maybe their inability to explain to themselves why something is happening to them makes it harder for them to cope. Like, think of a baby getting their first shot or having a thermometer up their bum. They suffer much more than any of us would in a similar situation, right? Because they don't know what's going on. Maybe it's the same for chickens. We can't really know, can we? Also, this justification fails to explain why we care more about the well-being of our friends and family than we do about the well-being of others, and why many of us would even care more for our pets' well-being than we would for that of a starving child across the world. And if any of you ever paid a vet to take care of your dog, or even bought a can of food for your cat, then you do care more about your pet, or you would just use that money to donate food to that starving child, right? So I want to offer another alternative, which I think coherently explains all of these. I'd be surprised if I'm the first person to come up with this idea, but I don't remember hearing it from anyone else. This alternative is kinship. We ground our morality in the well-being of sentient life, but when we make moral decisions, we give kinship a key role in deciding how to prioritize. We give those closer to us higher priority. But we didn't finish Alex's last tweet, so let's pick it up where we left off.
I feel Twitter leads to us talking past each other. You're more than welcome to make a second appearance on my podcast to clear this up.
To which Matt responds,
Are you planning a podcast on whether or not something is clickbait? Because that's the objection.
From this point on, Matt's abandoning his veganism and humanism are compatible line and tries to make it seem as though it's all about this clickbait accusation. But he actually originally led with his compatibility point, and for good reason. He can't really talk about the clickbait point without it. If ethical veganism and humanism actually are in conflict and Drew is an ethical vegan, then he's definitely not a humanist. And then the title is definitely not clickbait, right? Here's Alex's answer to this.
Come on, Matt. You also claim that humanism and ethical veganism do not conflict, citing the Humanist Manifesto 3. I highlighted a passage in the Humanist Manifesto 3 that conflicts with ethical veganism. You responded by asking if I value chickens more than humans. Will you admit that the manifesto you cited does in fact conflict with ethical veganism? Don't worry, I won't say if you don't, well, that ends it, like you did, because that wouldn't be a very skeptical attitude.
And this is when Matt blocked Alex.
No, goodbye. Don't need lessons from you on skepticism either.
And this is not the first time Matt and Alex had a tweet-off of this sort, including the part where Matt says that he is actually not saying what he seems to be saying. Last time was when Alex posted something about a veganism video that he made, and the amount of dislike that the video received within just 3 minutes of its release. What Matt had to say then is that Alex shouldn't expect people to watch the entire video before they react, because they already know what it's going to say, as this is what he's been sermonizing over and over. You might read that as Matt complaining that Alex makes too many videos on this same subject, as did I, and as many others did, including Alex.
Matt, I've made 7 videos about veganism. How many have you made about atheism? I'll keep talking over and over about animal abuse until the animal abuse is over. Thanks.
But Matt completely rejects that.
You're welcome. Sorry you're being snotty. I didn't suggest you shouldn't make videos on veganism, and the number of videos I've done on any subject is irrelevant to this. But I don't put up videos with bait-and-switch titles and seem surprised when people dislike quickly.
His only point is that Alex shouldn't be surprised that people assume they know where he's going with his videos. After all, it's not like he said that there is anything wrong with Alex sermonizing about the same things over and over. So, last time Matt wasn't saying that Alex makes too many videos on veganism, and this time he isn't saying that veganism and humanism are compatible. Now, like I said, I like and respect Matt, and if you do too, then we might be inclined to give Matt the benefit of the doubt. We might want to accept that his objections here have nothing to do with the fact that veganism is the topic at hand, and that he'd offer the same kinds of criticisms if he spotted these same problems in a video about any other topic. But this is getting harder and harder to do when we consider the general context. Things like the conversation he had on the atheist experience with Richard, aka Vegan Gains, and his constant refusal to debate animal ethics, both with Richard and really with anyone, it would seem. Matt has a reputation of a man who is very easily triggered by this topic, and for all his many positive attributes, he seems to really justify this reputation. But how terrible is this, really? I mean, why would anyone think that Matt is obligated to discuss veganism? Some people actually try to force him into this discussion when they call The Atheist Experience, a show that's explicitly about what people believe and why, not about animal ethics. And Matt doesn't want to have this conversation on AXP. But I actually think that Matt does have an obligation to treat this issue more seriously than he does. Firstly, because I think that everyone should think about the morality of their actions. I think that ignoring moral questions is in itself immoral. I know that it's not practical to actually do that regarding anything and everything, but I think that the more an issue is talked about, the less legitimate it is to ignore. And veganism these days is definitely talked about. You don't have to be vegan, but if you're not, you need to have good reason not to be. I don't think you can ethically afford to be intellectually lazy about this. But secondly, because Matt advocates for secular morality. That's part of what he chose to do with his life. That's part of what he does on the Atheist Experience, and on the Hang Up, and on debates. And that puts him in a position that I think makes his avoidance of these issues more problematic. At the very least, it means we should be able to criticize him for not taking this seriously enough. And seeing as he talks about morality within the context of the Atheist Experience, I think it's fair enough to call the show to talk to him about it. For example, I think that under secular morality, it is very difficult to come up with a sound justification for why you can't discriminate based on gender, but can discriminate based on species. If Richard feels the same, then the fact that he called in to the atheist experience shouldn't be surprising. Matt's moral views are a totally fair game. And of course, it's not just Matt. It's also Lloyd, as we'd seen before. It's Jimmy Snow, who I remember hearing proudly referring to himself as a human supremacist and a speciesist, to make fun of animal rights advocates who use these terms, to point out that the arbitrariness of only caring about the well-being of members of your species isn't that different from the arbitrariness of only caring about the well-being of members of your race, or of your gender, or your socio-economic class. I tried to find the video where Jimmy made these comments, but came up short, so I can't be sure that my memory of what he said is accurate. But after I made this video, and before I finished editing it, I was watching an episode of the Sometimes show which Jimmy hosts, and which I cannot recommend enough. And he made this serendipitous joke.
A study has revealed that dairy and meat companies have spent millions of dollars to lobby against climate change action. Now, for more information, head to the comments where you'll be able to find a number of vegans going absolutely wild. All right, what I actually just did there is I like to make mild jokes about vegans from time to time. That way I can get dozens of emails telling me that I'm as bad as Hitler.
Now, it is a funny joke. It's a nice spin on the very stale vegans can shut up about their veganism trope. And Jimmy's delivery is excellent as always. But unlike most of his jokes, it isn't thought-provoking, and it doesn't really engage with the topic. And it's not like Jimmy is the kind of guy that shies away from topics, including contentious ones, but somehow this topic never gets anything from him that goes any deeper than jokes like this. I wonder why. And it's also many others. Advocating against the abuse and exploitation of non-human animals is still widely considered something that's okay to make fun of, even by those who take other struggles for basic rights very seriously. Because even SJWs need to make fun of someone's bleeding heart, right? The vegans are gonna be mad is a sentence that people use too often in a dismissive way after saying something about burgers or bacon or whatever.
You're from Texas, I'm from Australia, we love barbecues, okay.
The vegans are going to hate us.
While they try not to think of the obvious parallels to a person making jokes about wife beating and then saying that the feminists are gonna be mad, or a white person using a racial slur and saying that the PC police is gonna be outraged. Or maybe when they say something about a barbecue or Thanksgiving turkey or what have you, they feel this nagging feeling that they know that this thing that they do is immoral, so they have to laugh it off, they have to minimize it, and they have to do that fast before they actually think about the changes that they need to make to their lives. And maybe not. I mean, maybe they don't even think about it. Or maybe they do, they still don't have to agree with me. I might be wrong. Maybe they do have serious moral basis for not going vegan, for not being sentientists. But if they do, then it's kind of weird that they never seem to want to actually discuss this and prefer instead to just laugh it off. And they don't want to discuss this. You don't find too many online debates on the subject where the person on the non-vegan side is someone that's pro-social change and social justice. And I think it really is rather telling. And if any of you out there want to have this discussion, then please let me know. Looking forward to reading your thoughts down below. If you found this video interesting, then you know the drill. Like, share, subscribe, ring the bell. And really, I am very open to honest discussion about why my ethical framework should be changed. Meanwhile, thank you all very much for watching, and remember, our world is complex, but it doesn't have to be complicated. Have a good one.